So I'm sure you've seen the guys at the football games. It's 20 degrees outside. They're not wearing a shirt. They've got their team colors painted all over their face, their arms, their stomachs, and it's all to show how much they love their team. And I can't help but think, do they really think that paint really helps the players on the field? Like the players look up and see them in the stands and think, now I'm motivated to play my best. Zeal's not always a bad thing. But in today's Dining Room Devo, we see that zeal is no match for calling. We're looking at Galatians 1:13 through 17. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me, but I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. In our last video, we talked about Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus and how he had persecuted the church before he saw the light. And Paul further explains this transformation in today's passage. When Paul was still Saul, he was a student of the teacher Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the premier, the top Jewish teacher of his day. And so as his student, Paul got to hang around all the most religious, most prestigious people in Israel. Paul says in verse 13 how he intensely persecuted the church. That word intensely in the Greek means beyond all bounds. In other words, Paul didn't just persecute Christians. He'd been brutal. He'd been violent and indignant in his persecution of believers. And doing so brought him praise from the Jewish leaders. And Paul, when he was still Saul, thought that he was pleasing God as well. Now, Jesus himself said that this kind of thing would happen, that those who killed us would think that they were doing God a favor, that they were pleasing God by doing so. And Paul becomes essentially the first to fulfill that prophecy. Paul may have considered himself a trailblazer, somebody who was showing his fellow Jews the right way to deal with these Christians. He'd been pleasing man, and he'd trusted his own works for salvation. Paul says here that he had been zealous for the traditions of my fathers. By traditions of my fathers, he's not simply talking about the law of Moses. He's talking about the oral traditions, the oral law that had been added, all those other rules added in on top of the law of Moses. Paul says, I had done all of those things. I was zealous about it. He kept not just the law of God, but the law of man. And the truth is that nothing but the call of Jesus Christ could have pulled him from the zealous, godless, works-based pursuits that he had thrown his life into. And zeal, as I mean it here, I'm defining it as working hard to show your love for a movement or an idea. And you can be zealous for a lot of different things. You can be zealous for political movements or for your occupation. You can be zealous for a music group. And people may admire your zeal. And the Jewish leaders certainly admired Saul's before he became Paul. But zeal in and of itself doesn't bring life, doesn't bring salvation. It doesn't bring completeness. And it is possible to zealously pursue the wrong things all the way to hell, which is what Paul was doing before he found Christ. But then there's a turning point in Paul's life, and he refers to it at the end of verse 15 and beginning of verse 16. It says that God, by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me. God was pleased to reveal himself. In other words, by his generosity and his grace, God saved Paul and called him to ministry. Now, did God call Paul as a result of Paul's zeal for God? Did God look down at Paul and say, wow, this guy's zealous, I want him on my team? Or was it because of Paul's hard work and as a Jew that God said, I need this guy? No, Paul tells us here that he was set apart from birth. In other words, it was God's plan before Paul was even born for him to be an apostle to the world. It was just by God's grace and God's sovereign will that Paul was called. It's very similar to what the prophet Jeremiah experienced. God said to Jeremiah in chapter 1, verse 5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." God had a plan for Paul's life that was different from what he was zealous for. It was to be an apostle, to take the good news of Jesus all over the Roman world. And Paul received that call through the very voice of Jesus Christ when Jesus declared Paul's purpose to reach the Gentiles at the beginning of his ministry. I have a question as we close. What are you pursuing? Paul learned that what he was zealously pursuing wasn't God's intentions for him. But Paul tells us in Philippians 3 what he learned to later pursue. In Philippians 3, 13 and 14, "Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. But one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus." Now, there are people today that love to show their zeal for God. They may speak loudly, they may speak often, and they take up grand causes. And sometimes it's really all to prove that they're true believers. It's to impress others. Now, it's great to be passionate. But be passionate about the right things. And Paul traded pursuing the traditions of his fathers for a pursuit of knowing Christ and of living the call that God had put on him before he was born. And he gives an example to us. Be passionate, but be passionate about what God has done for you, about the calling that you have on your life. Before time began, God chose you to be his child. He called you to salvation. So may everything you do spring from a spirit of worship and thanksgiving toward your Father. That is a zeal that's worth pursuing. Thank you for watching our Dining Room Devo. Feel free to share this video with somebody else. Leave a comment. Visit us at newparisfirst.com. Or if you're in New Paris on a Sunday morning, we'd love to see you at 10 a.m. May God bless you.